Good evening. My name is Liba Spring. Nick DiCarlo and I are the co-chairs of Seniors for Climate Action Now. Welcome to SCAN members and to so many interested people, 144 people registered. I want to tell you a brief story before we begin. After the launch of those private rockets, you remember that, into space, I had a discussion with my 91-year-old brother-in-law about space exploration. He was very much in favor, me not so much. I argued that there is no planet B, but he argued we'd better find one because we'd messed up this one so much it was too far to be recovered. And that is one of the attitudes that we climate activists have to deal with, hopelessness. But this evening's discussion is all about hope. Making Fossil Fuels History, Can Renewables Get Us There? Is a provocative title. I believe that most of us are on the side of science and hope. I should mention, by the way, that we're planning to record this session, so a version can be posted on SCAN's YouTube channel after the event. We'll be sending out the link to the recording to all registrants, and if you like what you see, please circulate it to anyone you think might be interested. We're also planning to send out a resource list of related materials so that anyone wanting to follow up or take a deeper look will have some handy references to start with. And now I call on Patricia Hayward from our Indigenous Solidarity Committee to pronounce the land acknowledgement.
There are people gathered here today from many parts of Canada. Throughout these territories, over millennia, there were Indigenous peoples who moved and settled and prospered. Today, Indigenous people are our neighbors, and we are theirs in sharing and caring for this land. I acknowledge that the SCAN organization is located in Takaranto, the place where the Iroquois Confederacy, the Ojibwe, and allied nations signed the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant to cooperatively use and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Our speaker, Mitchell Beer, works on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe in the city of Ottawa. Tonight, as we speak about fossil fuels, I wish to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of Northern Alberta in their home territories, where there have been decades of land-destroying oil and gas extraction. Let us acknowledge a continuing presence, stewardship, and responsible resistance of the Algonquian, the Athabascan, the Dene, and the Siouxstony peoples. In acknowledging the land and those who cared for it before us, we are also expressing gratitude for their sense of responsibility. These people looked to the future and acted to preserve their homelands for 7 generations, perhaps including us today. We recognize that our acknowledging prior and present Indigenous presence on this land is a beginning step in the challenging work of reconciliation.
Where am I?
You're there. You're on, Terry.
Yeah, I can't find myself. Am I muted or unmuted?
Now you're good.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Liba and Pat, for those comments. And so I'm going to be moderating this part of the presentation, and you'll hear from Liba later on toward the end of the meeting. So I wanted to just do a few introductory comments about what brought us to this point. To sponsor an event called Making Fossil Fuels History, and the question, can renewables get us there? Seniors for Climate Action Now, SCAN, published an analysis of the Liberal Climate Action Formula entitled A Recipe for Failure back in April of this year. Recipe for Failure exposes the Liberal Climate Action Formula as a fossil-first strategy designed to extend the life of the fossil fuel sector and Canada's carbon dependency. Tonight's presentation is one of SCAN's efforts to help frame what can be an alternative people and climate first action plan, which is a needed sort of counterpoint to what the Liberals are doing. This is SCAN's first independently sponsored public conversation as we try to find our footing inside of the larger climate justice movement. We think that discussions like this are essential as we try to have an impact, however minor, during the current federal election campaign. Election messaging has a huge capacity to create more heat than light about Canada's role in creating the climate emergency, as well as what we need to do to find an exit from its worst impacts on people and the biosphere. Tonight's featured speaker is Mitchell Beer, the editor of The Energy Mix, Canada's essential go-to source for summaries and critical analysis of the latest energy and climate developments. Preceding Mitchell's presentation, SCAN member Gail Greer will help set the context for why a rapid fossil fuel phase-out is essential to any serious strategy for avoiding climate chaos. Following Gail and Mitchell's presentations, we'll have a question and answer period, and we'll encourage you to put your comments and questions in the chat box. And I'll have more to say about key commenters and what their role is in the meeting later on. But just a kind of introduction to that, as a bridge to the open question and answer period, we've asked a few people to act as key commenters or first commenters from a number of climate action organizations to pose the first question, make a comment and pose the first question to Mitchell as a kind of a bridge to the open Q&A period. Now, we've planned for tonight's meeting to last approximately an hour and a half, depending on how many questions arise during the question and answer period. As was mentioned earlier, we are recording the presentations and the Q&A for posting on SCAN's YouTube channel. And just to reiterate, we have a resource list which will be mailed out after the event to everybody who's registered for the meeting. So with those introductory comments, I'd like to call on Gail Greer to kick things off for this evening. Gail is a SCAN member with a long history of environmental and climate justice activism and is a member of our education, campaigns, and platform committees. Over to you, Gail.
Thank you, Terry. This evening, I would like to touch briefly on global warming and fossil fuels, Canada's contribution, federal government policy, fossils first, and SCAN's People First climate plan. A rainforest like this once existed on Ellesmere Island. Then again, Toronto has been covered by ice half a mile thick. Variation by as little as 0.1% in the heat-trapping greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere, fine-tunes those changes. It's a true butterfly effect. Greenhouse gases are a minuscule part of the atmosphere. Over the last 800,000 years, carbon dioxide has oscillated from ice age lows of 170 parts per million to warm period peaks of 300 parts per million, a range of just 130 parts per million. Note the end of that graph, the sudden break upwards. The quantity of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has shot up to today's 415 parts per million, an addition of 115 parts per million. And the cause, a deeper wobble in Earth's orbit, volcanism, asteroids, not this time. It's not Mother Nature. We are the cause of that overshoot. The scientific evidence is now unequivocal, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And how have we done this? Primarily by burning fossil fuels for energy, which releases greenhouse gases. It began in the 18th century with the Industrial Revolution and the coal-fired powering of mass manufacturing, transportation, and heating. By 1950, the world was emitting 5 billion tons of carbon dioxide. Globally, we now emit over 36 billion tons annually, more than a 700% increase in just 70 years. The result, carbon dioxide at 415 parts per million in the atmosphere. The consequences so far, an increase of global average temperature of just 1.1 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. Insignificant? No. Enough to throw us into a world that is increasingly chaotic and uninhabitable for many, many species. The IPCC now projects that we will probably hit 1.5 degrees of such warming before 2040. And we won't stay below that threshold to greater devastation unless global emissions peak by 2025, just 4 years away. We caused this global warming. This means that we can change it, but we are in a code red zone. We must face the problem head on. We have to cap and phase out fossil fuels, which despite gains by clean renewables over the last few decades, still power about 78% of Canada's economy and the world's economy. And we must do this urgently. Global warming is an existential crisis arriving at exponential speed. Based just on our domestic emissions, we are the 10th, and Canada's contribution, domestically, we emit 730 million tons of carbon dioxide a year. Some say that's insignificant, only 2% of the whole. Remember, it doesn't take much, and it's more than double that amount when we include our fossil fuel exports, which generate another 954 million tons, more than the combined emissions of the United Kingdom and Japan, and probably part of them. Based on just our domestic emissions, we are the 10th largest emitter in the world. Per capita, we emit about 25 tons per year, more than 3 times the global average per person. The sectors of Canada's economy most responsible for our greenhouse gases are the oil and gas producing sector itself and transportation. In 2019, they accounted for 52% of total emissions in Canada. Greenhouse emissions from the oil and gas sector increased 87% from 1990 to 2019, from 102 to 191 million tons. Because of growth, the industry and our government are determined to continue. Canada has set and missed 9 greenhouse gas reduction targets over the last 30 years. Emissions have not decreased. In fact, they've increased most among G7 countries just since the 2015 Paris Agreement. The same year, the current Liberal government took power, vowing to tackle this problem. The Prime Minister recently announced Canada's nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement for 2030 is to be 40 to 45% emissions reductions from 2005 levels and to net zero by 2050. And what is the Liberal government's recipe for reaching those targets? Carbon pricing and hydrogen, blue from natural gas, carbon capture and underground storage, nuclear and small modular this time. Even the Canada Energy Regulators evolving scenario, including such measures, projects they will leave Canada largely dependent on carbon intensive energy through 2050, meaning we will come nowhere near those targets. It is a recipe for failure, an effort to save the fossil fuel industry at great public cost, a cost the industry with all its wealth wants the government to assume, as it often has, evidenced buying and building the Trans Mountain Pipeline, billions in subsidies to the industry a year, 18 billion in 2020. SCAN's people first climate plan formula is different. Fossil fuel phase out plus hard caps and clean renewables plus electrification will give us our fair share of reductions for Paris 2030. So let's ask Mitchell the burning question. Is that key energy transition out of fossil fuels into clean renewables actually feasible? Thank you.
Thank you, Gail, for helping us set the basic context for the connection between carbon pollution, the climate emergency, and the centrality of driving down greenhouse gas emissions as far and as fast as humanly possible. For many of you, Mitchell Beer needs no introduction. He's the publisher and key writer for The Energy Mix, an online website providing indispensable thrice weekly critical summaries of the latest energy and climate developments. If it's important, you'll find it in The Energy Mix. Having been a very close and astute observer of all things relevant to the understanding of both the scale of the climate emergency we face, as well as the strategies being advanced to address it, we could think of no one better placed to kick off one of the most important conversations within the climate movement today. How do we make fossil fuels history? And how far can renewable energy go in making that happen as fast enough in order to take a step back from the climate chaos? So it's my pleasure to introduce Mitchell Beer to everybody who's signed up for this event tonight. Mitchell, over to you.
Thanks very much, Terry. I'll try really hard to live up to that introduction, but the first test is whether I can get my slides on screen on the first try. So here we go. Can you see my my slides? You should have a front screen.
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you, Terry, Gail, for the opening segments, and thanks everybody for taking the time to be here this evening. As you mentioned, Patricia, I'm coming in today from unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory, also known as Ottawa, and the ground that I hope to cover today is, first of all, a quick prequel or a context to the ground that I've been asked to cover over the next half hour or so. First of all, whether a fossil fuel phase out is feasible. Secondly, on what timescale, and then whether renewable energy is ready for the challenge. And the spoiler alert is, hell yeah, renewables are ready. We're here. So the prequel, I mean, I am not going to dwell on the science because I'm sure everybody has already duly memorized the IPCC report, and Gail has just summarized the main takeaways from the science of the climate emergency. But really, the IPCC told us what we already knew, that it's dire, that the remaining atmospheric space for any more greenhouse gas emissions has not quite run out. It's about 12 or 13 years away, more or less, from running out, but it's getting close. And that what that dictates is really fast and deep emission cuts beginning right now. Interestingly, and I did want to emphasize this from the start, the IPCC called for particular attention to reductions in methane emissions. As you might know, methane is a faster acting greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. It doesn't stay in the atmosphere for as long. While it's there, however, it is 80 to 84 times more potent global warming agent than carbon dioxide over a 20-year span. So that's both a threat and an opportunity, and the IPCC talked about both. That I'll come back to this in a little bit more detail later, but basically, in a time when we really need to get ahead of this, methane is a focal point that they recommended as something positive that we can get started on, and essential that we can get started on right now. And I wanted to put that observation right up front. Because again, you've been reading the science, but what I think is really important to think about is how we address the report, how we respond to it, how we talk to it, speak to it in public. And this series of tweets began to appeared online 3 days before the report was issued. And I don't usually like reading out slides, but some of the key points from Dr. Elizabeth Sawin, who's the co-director and co-founder, I believe, of Climate Interactive in the US. Time to get ready for the report, she said, and repeat after me. every fraction of a degree averted is suffering averted. Just because you can't stop it all is not a reason to not prevent what suffering you can. There is no giving up, my friends. Also, she said there are tipping points in the human heart and in the collective consciousness that could be just as sudden and just as big as anything going on in the Earth system, even if it's not the IPCC's job to measure that or to track that. And she says there's nothing worse than giving up just shy of a tipping point and no way to know how close you might be. She continued, what will be most discouraging, and we've just seen this, what will be most discouraging about the report is if we assume that there will just be no or only a gradual increase in what she calls the soft stuff, people's willingness to connect, to give, to serve, to stand up. But at a time when the planet is only getting started burning and flooding, that's probably not a good assumption. And in fact, if you look back to the IPCC's last major report, their 1.5 degree pathway report in 2018, this kind of exponential growth in concern, in public protest, in advocacy, in policy, that all happened after 2018. And now we have the next report with 2 more from the IPCC to follow between now and next March. So Dr. Salwin says this could all be nudged towards something beautiful and powerful and useful and needed. And here's the first example. A commenter that we'll be hearing from in a few minutes responded to these tweets with the observation that Toronto endorsed the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty on July 15th. Lynn's question was, who's next? And scarcely a week later, we have the answer to who's next, because Sydney, Australia City Council, a large city council in one of the most notorious in the country, ruled right now by one of the world's most notorious climate-denying governments, Sydney, Australia, has unanimously endorsed the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. And I gather that was partly motivated, or at least the unanimity was partly motivated by the IPCC report. We also have the US author, historian, activist Rebecca Solnit in The Guardian last Friday, acknowledging obviously what we all know, that these results are dire, but Rebecca Solnit sees prospects for hope. The cautious optimism that she is expressing in the light of this devastating report is that there is now more certainty than ever in the science that real net zero, as opposed to greenwash net zero, will stop the warming and can still reverse it. We still have time to get that done. It's going to be tough, but we knew that before the IPCC report. And what the science is telling us is, yes, we can still get this done. That the tipping points in Earth systems that we've been so concerned about are unlikely if we can stay close to 1.5 and as quickly as possible get back to that threshold and then below. And fundamentally, that we know what to do, that there's a heightened sense of urgency. And as I was suggesting earlier, we can expect that to increase, partly due to the hard work of the people on this call that will continue after this call. So it is still true, as it's ever been, that nobody is offering us any guarantee that we can get this done. I don't remember anybody offering a guarantee. I wish they had. I really do. There is still no guarantees. And it is still true that the only way we are guaranteed to lose this battle of our lifetimes is if we assume that it's already lost, at a time when the last chapters of this story have still not yet been written, and we still have the power to write them. What I believe this leads into, and the reason I'm making this point, and really reinforcing what you were saying earlier, about the importance of hope and the importance of keeping that in focus, that anybody in light of the IPCC report, I really think that anybody in a position of climate leadership or climate organizing has a duty. It's not an option. We have a duty to not buy into the narrative of doom and despair that we've been hearing over the last 3 or 4 years, and certainly hearing over the last week. And that doesn't mean that we probably don't all need some time when we can find it, but sooner rather than later, to just sit with our own reactions to that report, and to really sit with that grief and rage for a little while, but all in the interest of processing it and then moving on and then getting on with the job of getting this problem solved. The other piece of the prequel is, I don't know, I've heard a rumor that there's a summer election on scheduled for September 20th. Maybe somebody can correct that in the Q&A. What's nice is that the polling leading up to the election has shown indeed that climate is a top tier issue for voters. A national poll by the Leger polling organization showed climate and environmental protection showing up as a top tier priority for 42% of respondents. Abacus data with 52%. Angus Reid in a poll in British Columbia only showed 45%. Yesterday, follow-up by Abacus showed the cost of living as a top priority for 62% of respondents. And in that poll, climate placed third. It was cost of living 62%, followed by healthcare, I think, at 47, and then climate at 46. And really, I don't think that is necessarily a worry for us, and it's not a surprise. You know, cost of living was a dominant concern in the 2019 campaign. Many of the searing economic inequalities in the country have been brought out and brought to the surface by the pandemic. So it's to be expected that this will be there. But what I think the data so far tells us is that, first of all, the issue that we are all committed to here this evening is on the minds of large proportions of voters. And secondly, that there are ways that we can deliver the message, and really ways that we can start out by listening before lecturing, to get a sense of what people are most concerned about, and then align climate solutions with those issues and concerns, whether or not somebody that we're talking to first presents with climate or with the climate emergency as their top concern. So is the phase out feasible? I mean, the easy answer, hell yeah. Zero carbon scenarios have been in production since the late 1970s, early 1980s. We didn't call them zero carbon scenarios then because the target wasn't the oil and gas industry. The fossil industry knew about the climate crisis in those days, but the rest of us didn't. But there are a few basic standard elements in pretty much any effective, credible low carbon scenario. And the first is the first one that is always forgotten and is always minimized and is absolutely an essential cornerstone, is to maximize energy efficiency. Pretty much anything in your line of sight, anything that you can think of in the society, is probably less energy efficient than it could be. And as we change out those processes, change out that infrastructure, we can increase efficiency. Not only is the cheapest unit of energy the unit that you never have to produce, but the lowest carbon unit of energy, or of energy services, of the stuff that we need back from the energy system, the lowest carbon unit of energy is the unit that you never have to produce by definition. So the process has to begin with maximizing efficiency so that we can then move into something that's already actually well underway in Canada because of the electricity mix that we've had to this point, but in other countries as well. And that is to electrify pretty much everything. Anything that currently depends on fuels, on fossil fuels, to be electrified. You see that the transition with electric vehicles is beginning. It's extending now to small and then larger freight vehicles. There are other uses as well that can be taken out of fossil fuels, much to the chagrin of the industry. And while that's happening, to decarbonize a grid that has historically been powered by coal, by natural gas, by nuclear, and shift that over to renewable sources. The fourth element of the scenario is nature-based solutions that rebuild the natural capacity of the land, of forests, of farm soils, to capture and sequester more carbon. And that's to be distinguished from the science fiction that we keep hearing from the fossil fuel industry, that somehow magically, if we attach industrial carbon capture devices to fossil fuel production, capture the carbon, inject it underground so that we can produce more fossil fuels. The science fiction of that is that we will somehow through that process end up with far less or far lower greenhouse gas emissions than far higher ones. But despite the emphasis that spin, that greenwashing has been receiving, there is still great potential in different forms of natural sequestration. It's not as simple as saying it, but the potential is there, and it is central to any zero carbon scenario. And then finally, the best of the scenarios put a lot of emphasis on energy democracy, on local control of energy, on more reliance on distributed energy resources, on indigenous energy sovereignty, which could and should be a whole presentation unto itself, delivered by the community practitioners who have their hand on those solutions. And these scenarios can point to millions or tens of millions of jobs. There was a projection published in 2018 that indicated 65 million jobs worldwide by 2030, if we get serious about this. And by now, I'm not sure 3 years later that it'll be 65 million jobs, but take that as a metaphor that there is a lot of job creation in this work, in this transition. The International Energy Agency in mid-May this year published a net zero by 2050 roadmap. And you need to bear in mind that this has never been really the IEA's job before. The International Energy Agency was founded in 1973 by oil-consuming nations to protect their right to consume oil. And that's the organization that concluded that to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius average global warming by 2050, that global oil consumption has to go down 75%, gas consumption has to go down 55%. And the big takeaway that we were all quoting like mad, and we need to keep quoting it like mad, no new oil, gas, or coal fields, not now, not ever. As of 2021, no new fossil fuel production. And that came from the International Energy Agency. They said it a little bit more elegantly than I've said it here, but that is basically a major takeaway from their report. Not quite a month later, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, this is the same organization that Lynn Adamson referred to in her tweet, published a fossil fuel exit strategy that was developed by Drs. Sven Teskey and Sarah Nicholas of the Institute for Sustainable Futures in Sydney, Australia. They called for an orderly wind down of fossil fuels with annual declines of 9% for gas, 6% for oil, 5% for coal, and a 2050 emissions target of 5.3 billion tons, 5.3 gigatons, compared to the 30-something billion that Gail quoted earlier. And I've also seen a figure of 43 billion tons for 2019. What was really just joyously significant in this report was a map of the world that showed the solar and wind potential by region. And overall, Teskey and Nicholas projected that the world has 50 times the solar and wind capacity that would be needed to hit 100% renewable energy, taking environmental concerns into account. So this is not a matter of, sort of converting every bit of land into renewable energy production. Quite the contrary, we have 50 times what we need with environmental factors taken care of. And the map in the report goes region by region and shows pretty much every part of the world with somewhere between a moderate and a massive surplus to the electricity that they'll need. I'll just mention as well that in 2019, Teskey produced a previous and a more detailed modeling study. This report was just 30 pages, but the 2019 modeling showed that 100% renewables and land restoration could bring us to 1.5 degrees climate stabilization without what he called unproven geoengineering technologies. So this is a quote from Sven Teskey. I'll break my own rule again and read it out quickly, that national governments must establish binding limits for the extraction volumes for coal, oil, and gas, and a just transition for workers from the fossil to the renewable energy industry. So, just catching our breath briefly here, on what timescale will this happen? It won't happen overnight, but we can get it done with the right sustained commitment from political and business leaders of all political stripes everywhere. And that begins with the kind of 2030 targets that Gail was talking about briefly earlier, as opposed to these nice sort of soft-toned 2050 net zero targets that we've been hearing announced pretty much everywhere over the last year or two, with very little and far less detail, far less effective practical detail on how we get the 2030 reductions done. And these institutions have had time to get those scenarios organized because we've known since the IPCC report in 2018 that to stay on track for 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need a 45% reduction in global emissions by 2030 so that we can get the rest done in the remaining 20 years. And not only that, but we've known for far longer that the disproportionate share of that work needs to be done by the richest countries that have the most resources, including Canada, that have the most resources to get this done and have historically had the greatest responsibility for the greenhouse gas emissions that are causing the climate emergency. So when you hear that Canada has a target of 40 to 45%, and the buzz is that we're going to aim for 40%, and of course, as Gail pointed out, we have such a great record of ever meeting our targets, that's not adequate in a global context. It's not adequate in terms of what we know we need to do to begin getting things in control in this crucial decade for climate action and for greenhouse gas reductions. The next step is to get the fossil industry on a timetable for a managed decline in their operations. And that begins, as the IEA said, with no new capacity, no new coal, no new oil and gas. And then an immediate and urgent priority that is high on the agenda for this year's UN climate conference coming up in less than 3 months now in Glasgow, Scotland, is to unlock the trillions of dollars in public and private investment that will be needed to drive and accelerate this transition. The last estimate that I saw yesterday was that the current level of investment needs to quintuple to get where we need to go. And that was just for 2 degrees Celsius, if I remember correctly. Crucially, this includes international climate finance. That is a promise that goes back to 2009 to the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen, where the rich countries promised that as of 2020, they would collectively allocate $100 billion per year to fund carbon reductions and climate transition work in poorer countries and in the countries that are most vulnerable to the climate crisis, and once again have had the least role in bringing the climate crisis about. The deadline was 2020. The countries that are supposed to be making the contributions are still playing definitional games about whether they really meant funding or whether they were just going to be offering repayable loans, once again, to many of the poorest countries in the world. And so that is an issue that's on the agenda for this year's COP, which has lots of problems attached to it that we can get into in the Q&A if anybody wants to. The other point is that as of 2009, the focus was primarily on climate change mitigation, on measures to either reduce or prevent greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, that's still important, but the crisis is upon us, and nowhere more than in those vulnerable countries and regions of the world that are often the most destitute. So what's needed as well is to allocate increasing amounts of funding to climate change adaptation to help countries cope with the impact, to anticipate severe weather. And that needs to be a funding priority now, as it's never been before. While we're talking timescale, there are some easy wins that we should be focusing on, and methane is the first. The main sources of atmospheric methane are oil and gas fracking, abandoned oil and gas wells. Alberta, we're looking at you, among others. Coal mines often emit large volumes of methane, animal agriculture. And an interesting development before I get to the interesting development, a major problem with methane is that there have been a number of reports over the last few years that so much of the methane going into the atmosphere is unmeasured, is underreported, and that's a particularly serious problem in the fracking fields in northeastern British Columbia and in many parts of Alberta. Over the last maybe 4 to 6 months, there has been a lot more satellite measurement of these methane emissions. There isn't enough of it going on yet, but it's really been quite nice, quite interesting to see a steady flow of news reports. The most recent one, I think, was a leaky pipeline in Iraq that had a methane plume over it, or methane coming from the Permian Basin in Texas. or a compressor station that went wrong in Alberta. Not that these are good news stories. There was one from China. None of these are good news stories, but it is good news that the measurement is being done by independent organizations that can begin holding these companies and these governments to account. And it is a really important issue for us to get at in Canada because so much of our methane is unmeasured. Fossil fuel subsidies and public finance for fossil fuels, again, Gail touched on this, but 2009 seems to be the banner year for rich countries to make promises that they don't intend to keep, because it was the G20 meeting in Pittsburgh in 2009 that promised that they were going to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. And when I first heard that, I thought, hey, this is great. They're not just phasing them out, but they're being pejorative. That's kind of undiplomatic, but sure, cool. It turned out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies is actually meant to limit the scope of what they're doing. What they mean is any fossil fuel subsidy that is considered economically inefficient in economists' terms. But even with that limitation, it's been 12 years and it still has not happened. Both subsidies and public finance have rolled right along and are enabling an industry that is moving into its sunset. In Canada, the subsidies are provincial as well as federal. The Jason Kenney government in Alberta dropped a few $1 billion of taxpayers' money because, of course, with all the economic devastation they've been going through in Alberta, they can sure afford it. Dumped a few $1 billion of taxpayers' money into TransCanada, hoping to encourage them to continue construction on the Keystone XL pipeline until that was canceled when Joe Biden entered the Oval Office. And the John Horgan government in British Columbia is said to have more than doubled its subsidies for liquefied natural gas and fracking since it took office in 2017. Now, the BC government disputes that characterization. The number comes from some public interest researchers, and I'm hoping that we'll be tracking that story down in the next couple of weeks. So I didn't intend that as a promotion for the energy mix, but we'll be carrying the story as soon as we have it. And then finally, something really important on the timescale is a national retrofit mission. This was a study that was released by Efficiency Canada a couple of months ago that envisions, it lays out a roadmap for Canada to pretty much bring every home and commercial building in the country to net zero emissions by 2035 with a program of mass and deep energy retrofits. This again could be a presentation unto itself. But quickly, if you think back to what I was saying before about net zero scenarios, where it starts out with efficiency and then goes to electrifying the grid. One of the things this study found was that there is enough electricity being wasted in the building sector right now, mostly through really, really inefficient baseboard heaters in some provinces, that changing out the building sector could free up enough electricity to power 10 million electric vehicles, which addresses a concern that otherwise comes up when we are trying to simultaneously change out vehicles from fuels to electricity and shut down the remaining coal plants in 4 Canadian provinces. This is one place to find the electricity to be able to do both and to truly decarbonize on the timescale and to the extent that we need to. Are renewables ready? Hell yeah. The technologies are practical, affordable, they're ready for prime time. Costs have been plummeting since about 2010 for both solar and wind. Energy storage is surging. There is more and more interest, more and more uptake, investment in battery storage, to a lesser extent in other forms of storage. And just to note that lithium ion will not likely be where battery technology ends up. But at this point, solar plus storage and wind plus storage are affordable enough now in, I think I read about 2/3 of the jurisdictions around the world, that in fact, building and financing a new solar plus storage or wind plus storage installation is cheaper than just continuing to operate a gas or a coal plant. So we keep seeing news going by, frankly, too fast to keep up with, of utilities across North America, around the world, changing out and getting out of their fossil fuel production. And for the remaining coal plants in Canada, the potential is right there, right in front of us today. Once again, efficiency first. I've been emphasizing that all the way through, but we never talk about it. We never think about it. And then if we do think about it, we never do it. So I'm mentioning it one more time. As of about 2030, green hydrogen, which is produced from wind or solar generated electricity, is expected to be affordable for some of the tough to decarbonize uses that aren't at this point considered practical for electricity generated by solar and wind. And again, the key point, and everybody here knows this, that it's perfectly doable and utterly unnecessary to take any of these scenarios and turn them into a pretext or an excuse to keep on using oil, gas, nuclear, with the right plan, with the right pathway. None of that is necessary. We can have a 100% renewable system. Change of this magnitude, change at the pace that we need, is going to be disruptive for households and communities that have been depending on fossil fuels for decades or for generations. And you hear stories from places like Appalachia in the United States, where it's, if it's not done right, it's difficult. But in a way, the fossil industry in Canada has been helping us make the case, helping us get where we need to go, inadvertently, of course, because they've already been demanding, as they like to say, for several years. And this is a term that I use but object to. It's their language. I hate this term on so many levels. But what they mean is replacing a workforce that they obviously defined in the 19th century, given the way they think of the gender of their workforce, but replacing that workforce either by just cutting jobs or by automating jobs. This has already been happening. It's been going on for years. And the quote from, I believe it was the chief financial officer at Cenovus Energy a few years ago, speaking to investors, was, hey, we can demand the ocean floor, we can demand the oil sands. So this has been industry strategy for some time. That might be part of the reason that in January, Jim Stanford, a former Unifor economist who now runs the Center for Future Work in British Columbia, reported that the surrounding economy has created 42 jobs for each one lost in the fossil industry since oil prices began to crash in 2014 or 15. Stanford also identified 18 communities across the country that are dependent on the fossil industry currently for at least 5% of their employment. So these are basically the single industry fossil towns, because once you get into indirect employment, that's a big hit if that activity shuts down. But when I saw that number, I thought two things. First of all, 18 communities. Okay, if we really mean that nobody gets left behind in this transition, and we'd better mean it, if we really mean it, then that's 18 communities, and we are responsible, all of us, to everybody in those communities to make sure that the transition works for them. And my second reaction was, only 18 communities, that's really doable. It doesn't mean that it's doable just by saying so, and it doesn't mean that it's doable overnight, but it really puts some bounds around what we need to get done to really make a just transition work. And I find that number really encouraging as a starting point for getting it done and getting it done right, particularly because the survey in the last month by Iron and Earth, which is an excellent organization started by current and former workers in the oil sands industry. This organization is born and bred in the Alberta oil patch. They've conducted a survey that was published in the last month, indicating that 2/3 of fossil fuel workers want to bring their electrician skills, their welder skills to the clean energy economy. And what they want is the retraining and the upskilling that will enable them to do that. So I'm going to close on something that I honestly have never understood, and maybe somebody can explain it in the Q&A. I'd be really grateful. And that is that if you look at this chart, for which I have to thank Angela Bischoff from the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, OCA has been using versions of this chart for a while, and this is the latest update as of April 2021. If you look at the contrast between the least cost source, which is energy efficiency, and the highest cost, which in this case is a new proposed small modular nuclear reactor for the Greater Toronto Area. Really, what this chart tells you is that if you happen to be in Ontario, you have a choice between pretty much putting an end to energy poverty through a mass deep energy retrofit program that begins at 1.7 cents per kilowatt hour, versus running a really serious risk of nuclear weapons proliferation at a cost of 16.3 cents, provided the reactor works, since no detailed engineering has even been done on it yet. So, I mean, I don't know, it's a difficult choice, you decide. But what I can't understand is why, to my knowledge, none of us in the climate and energy community have ever run a sustained, continual campaign to not only make all the points we're already making, but also to emphasize that what we are about is a least cost energy strategy. Because on one hand, the cost of the technology, the relative cost of the different options is not the reason that most, or probably any of us on this call, got involved with this fight. At the same time, anybody who's in Ontario knows that we've been in a fight for a very long time where the renewables have been cast as the high cost option, where they've been blamed for costs that really had nothing to do with the transition to renewable energy. So if we have these arguments, I don't know why we don't start out from where those particular communities of interest are at and build a wider community of concern, a wider bubble of support for climate action by making the case that this is not only essential and urgent for all the reasons we've been saying, but if your primary concern is about cutting costs or minimizing costs, we've got you covered. So I think I've probably gone a little or maybe somewhat over the half hour. I apologize for that, but I'm going to hold it here. And I'm really looking forward to the Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much, Mitchell, for that presentation. I know that the role of renewables and the possibility of renewables being able to displace fossil fuels in the time, at the scale and in the time sequence that's really going to make a difference to the climate emergency is top of mind for a lot of people. And I thank you for that presentation, because I think that that's helped frame our discussion that's going to take place now. So thank you very much for that. I'm sure that presentation will have raised a number of important questions that could be further addressed in the Q&A that's coming up very soon. If you've got any comments or questions that arise out of anything that Mitchell has put forward tonight, I encourage you to put it into the chat function, and I will go through that systematically once we've got through a number of initial questions from what we're calling first commenters. So we've invited SCAN to have three representatives from various climate organizations perform the function of being a first commenter, to make a comment and a question about a key theme that Mitchell has referred to. The first key commenter I'd like to call on is Betty Plewis from Climate Legacy, an organization dedicated to engaging and mobilizing older Canadians in climate action through their voice, their time, and their money. Betty, thank you for joining us this evening. What's your comment and question that you'd like to put to Mitchell?
Well, thanks, Terry, and thank you, Mitchell. I think Mitchell and Gail have done a really good job of outlining the nature and urgency of the crisis, and they've also indicated some areas for action. And they've also let us know that we have much of the knowledge and the ability to make the changes that we need to make. One of the articles that Mitchell cited from The Guardian says that many of the obstacles that we have at the moment are in fact political. And Mitchell has alluded to this, that this will require a massive mobilization of civil society in order to push this vision that we have forward. So my question for Mitchell is, how can we as civil society organizations be more effective in pushing for the transition from fossil fuels to a zero carbon scenario?
Thanks very much, Betty. I alluded to some of this just at the end with the least cost energy chart. An idea that a few of us have been working with over the last few years, and this is not by any stretch to talk down or minimize or to suggest we stop the direct advocacy that we've been doing both on carbon reductions and on shutting down fossil fuel infrastructure, but to try to expand on that, to reach out to a wider community of interest, a wider community of voters who aren't yet engaging with the messaging that we've done so far. I don't want to go too long about this because I know we have limited time and I've already taken up too much of it, but what really got me on this track was the initial presentations around the 2018 IPCC report, when what we heard from one of the scientists on the presentation panel was that we know what we know what we need to get done. We have the technologies that are ready for prime time. What's missing is political will. Well, that's something we've been saying for many, many years. And at that point, we knew that usually when politicians did what we asked and showed political will, the result would be that they would learn that no good deed went unforgiven, because in the next election, they would get unelected, disaster would ensue when whatever minimal inadequate programs they put in place were undone by whoever succeeded them, often taking office having promised to do exactly that. So I think it's really important for us to think through who are the different audiences, who are the different communities of interest that can be influential on this, and what motivates them. It might not be an IPCC report. It might not be a pipeline campaign. It might not be a campaign focused on the 5 big banks. And that's not to say that any of that should not or must not happen. Of course it must. But if that's not what is getting us the critical mass we need to win. So to me, the question is, what more do we need? And how do we get that done with limited time and limited resources?
That's probably another webinar.
It is, at least one. Let's do that.
Right.
Okay, thank you, Lynn, very much for that comment and that question. And Mitchell, thanks for your response to it. Our next key commenter is Lynn Adamson from Climate Fast. Climate Fast is, and Mitchell, you mentioned this during the course of your presentation, Climate Fast, as the name telegraphs, promotes urgent action to address the climate emergency by political and economic leaders. Climate Fast was most recently involved in the campaign to have Toronto City Council sign the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Lynn, thank you for joining us tonight. Could you tell us what your comment and put a question to Mitchell?
Thank you very much. I wanted to say, first of all, a thank you to Mitchell for talking about mission retrofit. It's incredibly important that we get the foundation of a really wide and really deep and really effective retrofit program right across the country. And we don't have it right now. They'll brag about their program, but it is not enough buildings and it is not enough money. It is just not going to get the job done. It's maybe 10% of what's needed. So I think it's really important that we recognize that that's in the efficiency category that you talked about being the lowest cost. And also in Toronto, for example, more than 50% of our emissions are from buildings, and we need to convert off gas and onto heat pumps. And that's going to take some both regulations and incentives to make it happen. So I hope people will get involved in asking questions about that and insisting on a better program through this campaign. But I did also want to mention I think it's extremely important that we have campaigns that engage constituents. So I like what you were just talking about, how do we mobilize people for the political will that we need? And Climate Fast has been working on climate conversations program for that. However, that takes a lot of time. So we're also mobilizing around the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty because when constituents get in at the ground level and get their own municipalities to vote on it, as we've done in Toronto and Vancouver, then that puts pressure on the federal level, which is the level that we need to say no to fossil fuels. So that is a pledge campaign that we want to push through the election, and anyone who is interested, please be in touch. We want this in as many ridings as possible, and it needs to come from constituents. That's what's the most important for political will. So the question I'd like to ask you, Mitchell, is how important actually is it for Canada to just say no to the oil and gas industry, finally endorse the treaty, and be involved in international negotiations to get this around the world? If that's important, why is it important? Just talk about the potential of that campaign for a minute, if you would mind. Thank you.
For Canada to endorse the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it's desperately important for Canada to really step up and do its share, to be a part of a managed shutdown of the fossil fuel industry for a bunch of different reasons. One is just the numbers that we heard from Gail, that it is not only our domestic consumption, but also our exports. It is inherent to the climate crisis that no single country can reduce emissions enough to make the decisive difference, which means that every country that is under pressure to do so can say, oh, well, we're just 2%, or we're just 4%, or we're just point whatever. Why are you picking on us? Talk to somebody else. When in fact, it only works if everyone does it. At the international level, we have a lot more traction, a lot more ability to make the case for faster, deeper cuts if we've been doing our part. And there is also, frankly, a vested interest in Canada getting its act together on this. And I think this is another area, or another area where we might be able to find ground to reach out farther and wider to communities of interest that we haven't been close enough with as yet. And that is that this whole transition is always framed as a matter of loss and pain. Okay, fine, we're going to do the transition because the IPCC says so, but it's going to hurt. What if it's a matter of opportunity and gain? Starting with those estimated 65 million or so jobs by 2030. And so in many ways, the least important, but the most persuasive reason to do this for some communities of interest that we need is that if we don't do this, we're going to get left behind. That if Canada is still buying the line, buying this science fiction that I was talking about earlier, that we can somehow decarbonize the fossil industry. And if we put all of our effort and emphasis into that, while the rest of the world is busy, or much of the rest of the world is busily, merrily decarbonizing, and none of it anywhere is going fast enough yet, but I can tell you the rest of the world is on that track. To produce our digest, we have to scan through at least 1,200 headlines a week just to make the story line up, and it's impossible to keep track of, which is a horrible and wonderful problem to have. So if we don't get our act together economically, we will be left behind. It would be as though a century ago, we had decided that for some reason, probably related to their campaign contributions, we really, really, really were full square behind the buggy whip makers. That Henry Ford guy, he'll never do anything. He's an old anti-Semite anyway, right? And then suddenly, well, guess what? There's no demand for buggy whips. That's where we're at. We are seeing estimates of tens of billions of dollars or more, trillions of dollars in stranded assets, essentially oil and gas operations that investors have put money into, countries have put money into, for which there is no further demand. And that risk is going to increase as time goes on. So Canada has that interest in making the shift, even if the rest didn't matter and didn't matter more. Just in its own self-interest, the country needs to make the shift, and every province and every city need to as well.
So Lynn, I thank you for that comment and that question. And once again, thank you, Mitchell, for that response. Our final first commenter is Roly Montpellier from Below 2 Degrees, and an organization focused on, quote, making Canada fossil-free during the lifetime of children alive today, unquote. Among a host of other things, Below 2 Degrees has sponsored a very popular, prolific, and effective weekly virtual public engagement series called Time for Action during the pandemic. Roly is one of the founders of Below 2 Degrees and is our third and final first commenter. Welcome, Roly, and thank you for joining us tonight. What would you like to highlight from Mitchell's presentation, and what question would you like him to answer?
Thank you, Terry, for that fine introduction. There are two words which really struck me from Mitchell's presentation, very profound words, when he was referring to, can we do the transition to clean energy? And his two words were, "Oh yeah." So Mitchell, thank you for that. That's but I think it's very important that we understand that, yes, we can do this in spite of the dire picture that the IPCC has painted for us. And just quickly, we do have a window of opportunity in the next, the election is what, 33 days away, and then COP26 in Glasgow, I think it's 50 some days away. So Mitchell, my question is coming from a slide that I'm looking at on my screen here, on my monitor, and it's actually from Chris Hatch's report, What Do Canadians Really Think About Climate? And on this slide, basically he says that the demand for action is much lower than concern. And he refers to 45% of Canadians as the muddled or the movable middle. And as you mentioned in some of the polls that are coming out right now, climate will be a big issue, or perhaps the top issue in this election. So how can we focus on that? I call it the muddled middle, but the movable middle, because that group, that 45%, could really tip the scales in favor of much more rapid climate action by whichever government gets elected. Just wondering if you can address that.
Thanks, Philly. I guess what I would suggest for the campaign period is that we proceed along two tracks, and by the way, two nonpartisan tracks, because this is about all the parties. The first is, yes, obviously, to try to get as many climate voices front and center through all the mechanisms that we know, through all candidates meetings, through report cards, through commercial media, through social media, all the things that we always do. To really try to push climate concern and climate action as close to the top of the agenda that we can. My one worry about that, and then again, this is not to say not to do it. It's more of a yes and. Okay, I mean, that in addition to that standard campaign work that we always do during an election, we have a month. There are other issues on people's mind. There are issues that are beyond our control. If COVID infection rates spike, and there are provincial premiers that have been doing their best to reduce safety, reduce controls on the spread of the virus, that may become more prominent. So I guess what I've been curious about, and this is maybe more a question back to all than a conclusion I've reached, but in addition to doing all the things that we would do in an election campaign, do we want to be deliberately thinking through how we connect with people, how we maybe have longer conversations than we normally would in a campaign, in an election campaign interaction, so that those relationships that we build with a wider community of interest are still with us the morning after the election. There is a technique of deep organizing, deep canvassing that takes a lot longer. It actually connects with people on a human level rather than just trying to identify the vote. It takes longer, and eventually it gets the job done. And I know of one organization only in BC right now that is applying that election campaign technique to climate awareness and climate action. By the way, it's believed to be one of the techniques that won Georgia for the Democrats last January. Something to keep in mind in Ontario is that we have the trifecta, for better and for worse. We're in a federal election now. We have a provincial election ending by June 2nd, and municipal elections are October 24th next year. So mark your calendars. If we can stand, get a good rest now or right after this one, because that'll be your last chance. If we begin identifying those wider sources of support now and keep building and nurturing those conversations and relationships, and use this campaign and the next two for continuing to do that. It may well be too late for us to shift the momentum or certainly to shift the outcome of the federal campaign. We can try for the provincial, but if the net result of what we get done is that starting now delivers on what Lynn was saying a few minutes ago, that changing things out at the municipal level gets the attention of all orders of government, right? If the work that we're doing now means that we can actually change out Ottawa and Toronto City Council in a year and a half, less than a year and a half, that ain't nothing. Quite the contrary, it's huge. So again, a question, not an assertion, because I'm not, you never want to give up any opportunity. But I wonder if that's really what we're about here, that if we're in it for the long haul, maybe the second and third campaign is what we're already building towards now, given the time we have available, the resources in our hands.
Okay.
I'll be really curious for comments on that, because that's kind of heresy in the middle of the campaign.
Okay, thank you, Betty, Lynn and Rolly for your questions. And I'm now going to bridge to the questions that are in the comments that are in the chat function. And if you haven't already had a chance to put your comment or question in there, please do so, so that we can put those questions to Mitchell and have as much of a conversation about the issues that matter to you as we possibly can in the remaining time. So there is a question from Brendan, who's asking about the 40% reduction versus I guess what he's asking is about the targets that need to be met by 2030 versus 2050, and wants to have you comment on clarifying what number needs to be reached in order for us to be able to have a reasonable chance of achieving 1.5C.
Well, again, what we heard from the thanks, Brendan, and thanks, Terry. What we heard from the IPCC in 2018 is that it needs to be 45% across the board, 45% worldwide, and that needs to disproportionately come from the richest and from the most industrialized countries for the reasons that I laid out. The one firm number that I've seen on that in Canada is a group of climate groups that advocated for 60% by 2030. But that was based on, I'd say, modeling that was a good start, but still needs more work in the sense that it hinged on things like a tripling in the target price on carbon, which first of all assumes that a carbon price works as mechanistically as its proponents believe, which is maybe so, maybe not, and that's a whole other webinar topic in itself. It also assumes that a carbon price at that level by 2030 is something that anyone can survive politically. So I think that 60% in that release was probably in the ballpark of the right target for Canada for 2030, but how we get there, I think needs more thought and more discussion. And actually, now that I think of it, I wish I had thought to ask somebody this before we started the session today. The reductions that are in the efficiency gains, the consumption reductions that are in the National Retrofit Mission Report, I'm certain were not incorporated in that 60% scenario. So thinking through all of the different things that we can legitimately do to get to a 60% target might not be a bad first step. And to my knowledge, anyone please correct me if this is wrong, I have not seen that that's been done yet for Canada.
Okay, so someone by the name of S. McIntyre got an email from Pierre Poilievre from the—
You have my sympathies.
From the Progressive Conservatives yesterday, indicating that Alberta and Saskatchewan are perfecting carbon capture, a technology that puts carbon back where it came from in the ground. In fact, I guess this is quoting Pierre, Canada's Whitecap Resources is the world's only carbon negative company. That is to say, the company captures and stores more carbon than it emits. Well, S. McIntyre would like you to respond to that.
Thank you for asking about that. I had not seen that email, but I'm certainly familiar with that line of argument. There's so much to be said about carbon capture, but a key point maybe to start from is that there has been so much talk about decarbonizing the process of producing fossil fuels in Alberta, Saskatchewan, or wherever else. And when you look at the amount of the total emissions associated with extracting, transporting, and burning a barrel of oil, 20% of those emissions happen at the point of production, and roughly 80%, and I'm sort of leaving out transportation in the middle here, but something like 80% get emitted when the product reaches its endpoint, reaches its delivery point, and is used as directed. So even if Canadian producers could really produce that net negative or net zero barrel, and there are really serious questions about that, and what you are reading, I would suggest, is greenwashing that fact. But they have, and I think there has been a lot of sincere effort within the fossil industry to try to decarbonize production emissions. You never hear people talk about that other 80%, because it goes into another country's greenhouse gas inventory, but it still ends up in the same atmosphere, and it still drives the same problem.
Okay, so Pierre apparently was quite active on email the other day, and he's been talking about the shutting down of foreign coal-fired plants with the export of our natural gas. Replacing coal with natural gas for electricity has led, he says, to a massive reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the US over the last 20 years. He then asserts that we can do the same thing globally. How do you respond to that?
I'm not familiar with those particular numbers. I do know that more and more natural gas now in Canada and the US and elsewhere is fracked gas, and that leads into the very, very deeply serious problems with methane emissions, often unmeasured methane emissions, that I was talking about earlier. I'm not familiar with that export relationship to the United States, but I know that one of the, and there's a really interesting multi-partisan thing. Poilievre is a conservative, and John Horgan in BC is New Democrat, and I think they would probably agree on the great potential for natural gas to offset coal, which means we live in weird and disturbing times, and I shouldn't have said that on a recording. However, the argument from British Columbia, and this has been from both Liberal and NDP provincial governments, has been that fracked gas exports from BC will offset coal consumption in China and other economies in Asia, and that'll be a net benefit for the climate. There are only two problems with that argument. One is with the production side, and the other is with the consumption. On the production side, again, we have unmeasured, unacknowledged, unmonitored, uncontrolled methane emissions that really are a desperately serious problem that the latest IPCC report pointed to as an immediate opportunity to start getting ahead of the climate emergency. And then on the consumption side, those imports from the point of view of the receiving country are more expensive than the options that they can pursue simply by opting for energy efficiency and renewables. So increasingly, those exports are becoming more of a myth than a reality. As I say, I can't speak to the, well, maybe a little bit, the exports from Canada to the US. Again, I know that in the US, gas plants are starting to be replaced by saner production and energy efficiency plans that are both more affordable to those utilities and those consumers, and also lower carbon.
Okay, so there's a comment from somebody who obviously lives close to Haliburton County, that he built a 2,400 square foot home, and I guess installed the solar power energy himself, and it costs less than a conventional build to do so. And he's commenting that he doesn't think that external incentives are necessary to do the right thing. Can you speak a little bit about what the size of the problem is with respect to the conversion of our built infrastructure, and whether or not that can be done through individual initiative, or it's going to need a collective effort?
Of course, it's going to need a collective effort. You know, if we had until the end of the century or beyond to get this done, then we could count on individual action. We could count, and not say that that's not important. But you know, we could count on the slower moving measures, the slower moving methods to gradually get us there. We have this decade to reduce global emissions 45%, and that means we need all hands on deck. We need incentives, we need programs, we need regulation, we need it all because of the scope and the scale of the problem. Please don't let me minimize my utter admiration for somebody who has the ability to install their own. That's brilliant. But not everyone's, a lot of folks are not going to have the capacity to do that. And by the way, one of the really important findings from the National Retrofit Mission Report is that by making this a program, by making it a coordinated program where buildings are done by the 100 or by the 500, not one at a time, one of the things that you're doing is eliminating energy poverty, which means that for people who have to choose between food and fuel, if we get this done right, that's not going to be a problem anymore. And where I think that ties into the comment or the question is that there are a lot of people who are not only not going to have the technical ability, but will not have the dollars or just the household capacity to do what you've done. And that is not to, again, brilliant, well done. Not everyone's going to be able to follow your lead. And this needs to be by everybody and for everybody very quickly.
Okay, so Ann Pohl says that she didn't hear you take a clear position on nuclear development. And she's asking,
I do apologize.
Do you have one? Do you have one? And if so, what
Only
is it?
since the 1970s. No, thank you for that. Was it all unclear? Thank you for asking, and thank you for asking it that way, because really, you know, giving talks on this topic, one of the most commonly asked questions you get is, well, you know, what about nuclear? Don't we need that? Well, no. The way I usually like to frame it, just for the sake of uncharacteristic brevity, is that the economics of nuclear energy are so bad that you can make an airtight case against it without even using the word Fukushima. See what I did there? The argument from the nuclear industry right now, and this showed up in Angela's slide, is that small, which they're not, modular nuclear reactors are the future of the industry and the future of the effort to decarbonize. There is a brilliant nuclear analyst based in Paris, France, named Michael Schneider, who produces an annual report on the truly sorry state of the nuclear industry. He quite delightfully refers to small modular reactors as PowerPoint reactors. The point he's making is that they're being hyped and touted as only the nuclear industry knows how to do. Oh, wait a minute, the fossils do that too. Never mind. But in fact, there's no detailed engineering behind them. So on one hand, we are hearing that small modular reactors are a part of the solution to a climate crisis that needs to be at least 45% solved by 2030. But on the other hand, they are nowhere near imaginably ready for prime time. And as far as the industry as a whole in Canada, never forget that the Darlington Nuclear Station in Ontario ran so far over budget that it bankrupted what at the time was the second largest power utility in North America. Anybody remember Ontario Hydro? We've been paying for that through our power bills ever since. And the province thought that was such a great idea that they said, hey, let's refurbish Darlington and do it again. There is no need for that technology. The SMRs are a serious risk of nuclear weapons proliferation, as critical analysis has shown. But bottom line, no, there is no need for any nuclear energy in a legitimate zero carbon scenario.
Okay, Herman,
did that work?
Yeah. We'll see. There's lots of time for response. So Herman Rosenfeld has put a comment in the chat about green jobs, Oshawa, and you mentioned energy democracy and the role that energy democracy and distributed energy, but also, you know, a renewed commitment to battery operated vehicles, the electrification of everything. And that's an example of a project that was going to be, that the proposal was to use the largely abandoned GM plant. GM, by the way, still owes us $5 billion, give or take, from the financial crisis. I guess what this raises is the importance of initiatives like that. And how central are they to trying to get the kind of investment in renewables and in renewable technology that we're not seeing from the federal government or the provincial governments at the scale that is necessary to address the crisis. You say a few more words about that energy democracy piece and the importance of groups like Green Jobs Oshawa.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that distributed energy democracy, local renewable energy and energy efficiency solutions are an immensely important way of, first of all, as you say, getting more control of our energy consumption, energy demand, energy use back into the hands of consumers. There are energy co-ops that are producing a fairly large share of the electricity in some European countries. And these are being done by and for the community, and it's working. I have not seen the distributed generation in itself is enough to replace the whole system. We've had a really rigidly centralized electricity system for generations, and I don't think I can ever remember seeing any indication that all of that can be changed out. But certainly having more distributed resources in place, having that kind of support for local programs, certainly in remote communities, where what you're doing is changing out diesel, where what you lose by the carbon impact, you gain by the health impact and high cost. I mean, there is really no benefit to diesel generation as long as there is some anything else that a rural community can do. So I think picking your spots, finding where it makes sense, finding where it's possible to build community buy-in, yes, that is something that it makes every bit of sense for governments at all levels to support. And by the way, once that activity starts to happen, people who are either involved or who can see it happening next door begin to see themselves in the picture, and begin to realize that, no, this is not just some esoteric thing. This is not just in California. It doesn't mean I just have to put up with Elon Musk's ego. No, this is real stuff that my neighbor is doing, that my in-laws are doing. And then at that point, that does help build the constituency for faster, deeper carbon cuts through a renewable energy transition.
I'm going to encourage people to have a look at the chat, the comments in chat. There's a bunch of really useful information with respect to upcoming events, other organizations you might want to check out. And so we're not going to have a chance to go through, all those kinds of comments, but check it out. You can save a copy of chat if you just click on the three dots at the lower, end of the chat box, and so you can have a look at those comments at your leisure. So Ellen Tolmie has got an interesting question with respect to the transition from fossil to renewables and the problem in terms of the lower incomes that are being experienced by workers in the United States in particular. She's referencing a New York Times article about just how low those wages are in relationship to wages within the fossil sector. And she's asking how that can be addressed.
It's such an important issue. And in fact, I had a slide on that, but I think I already ran over today and did not run over more because that was one of the slides that I had to get rid of before we started. But no, it really is an important issue. When you hear fossil fuel workers in some parts of the US in particular objecting to the transition, it's because fossil fuel employment, for all the things wrong with it, it's unionized and relatively high wage work. And the argument for a just transition is that the renewables have to deliver on that as well. Energy efficiency has to deliver on that as well. I meant to check before we started today. There was an agreement recently signed, I want to say either in New Jersey or New York State. I believe it had to do with an offshore wind project being led by Ørsted from Europe, where there was an agreement that yes, these will be unionized jobs and it will be the project will incorporate union wages. That has to be the rule, not the exception. It has to be the example others follow, so that those benefits really do flow through to households and communities.
Okay, I think that we're at 8:30, so I think we're going to have to leave it there. And I want to thank you, Mitchell, for your presentation and your answers to those questions. I want to thank the first commenters for those, and everybody who's put comments and questions into the chat function. And so I like to call on David Robertson to make a few final comments and to wrap up tonight's content side of the presentations. David?
Thanks. I'm part of SCAN's education committee, and again, this has been just a great presentation and a great discussion. After a week of very bad news, the IPCC's Code Red report and Trudeau's arrogant call for an election, for me, tonight was a needed antidote. And I know I'm leaving with a bit more hope, and I'm leaving with a bit more determination. And I want to thank all of the contributors to tonight's session for giving me that hope and determination. Gail, I think you set the stage very well. You know, some facts and figures, but the context to make sense of them and the sense of urgency to change them. And I think that was just dead on. Betty, Rolly, and Lynn, I think your comments were definitely to the point. Your focus on the need for action, I think really framed the discussion that we need to have. And I thank you for that focus and your participation. And Mitchell, for spending the evening with us. That your knowledge and easy familiarity with the issues, your what has to be a very clear-headed assessment, your commitment, and not least, your sense of optimism is really needed. And it gave us, I think, a lot to think about and a lot to work with. And so thank you for that. Mitchell, as many of you know, is the publisher and the editor of The Energy Mix. And I'm going to just do a very short plug here, because in my mind, The Energy Mix is an incredible resource. It's an information digest that not only summarizes the news around climate, but actually analyzes the issues. And it's rare that you go to one spot and you get both of those pieces, summary and analysis. And I think that every climate activist's bookshelf should include a subscription to The Energy Mix. So if any of you here don't already subscribe, check it out. It's really worth it. And it's just incredible. So again, Mitchell, thanks for tonight's presentation. It was even judging by comments in the chat, it was great.
Thank you, David. I'm sorry, if I could just interrupt you really quickly. First of all, as you said that about the Energy Mix, thank you. I put up a link to our website, and somebody sent me a direct message saying that the website is down. We'll be back by morning. I'm just learning that now. We will be back by morning. Subscriptions are free, and we would love to have you as part of our community.
Okay, thanks for that. Before I turn the mic back to Liba, I also want to thank Eric Lilius and Nick DiCarlo, who is one of the SCAN co-chairs, for their kind of behind the scenes work, that they got all the registrations done and they made sure the technology worked. And so I really think that that support is invaluable, and we couldn't have done tonight without that help. I also want to thank Terry for a great job moderating the panel and for curating the chat. Reading the chat and capturing people's comments and questions and turning it into a question, I guess it's like chewing gum and walking at the same time. It's hard. I'm glad Terry's ambidextrous, so that you made it look easy and it was very effective. So thanks for all of that. And to everyone who showed up tonight, I want to thank you, because this is a summer night. And to spend a willingness to spend a summer night in this kind of discussion is really important. I think that your eager contributions really helped the evening a lot, and your willingness to share your thoughts was incredibly important. So thank you all for turning up. As we've heard a number of times, there's an election in 5 weeks. It's hard to know what we can do in such a short time, but we have to try and do something. We have to try to bring more attention to the fact that we are in a climate emergency, that we have to stop burning fossil fuels, that we have to start investing in clean energy, and that we need to develop a broad-based people's climate plan. And I think that by working together, that we will find a way to get those messages out and influencing people, as Mitchell has talked about our need to influence people. SCAN has started some internal discussions, very brief and very rudimentary, about what we do after the election, because as soon as the election is done, we know we're going to be with the Fridays for Future September 24th, and we know right on the heels in terms of how time moves, we'll be at COP26. And we're starting to think in SCAN that what is the possibility of organizing a series of events before, during, and after COP26, events that could be organized around the notion of a People's Climate Summit. And so for us, it's early days talking about that, but we would invite everyone here to help us think through whether or not that is worth doing, what the possibilities are, and how we go from this election to COP26. And for those of us in Ontario, SCAN has a project that's called the Ontario Working Group. We are right now talking about Ford's climate crimes. We're up to 27 of them. So we've got kind of 27 one-pagers on Ford climate crimes. And coming out of this election, COP26, we want to start building towards the Ontario election. And again, we look forward to working with everyone on that. And with that, I'll just turn it back over to Liba.
Thank you, David. And thank you all for a very inspiring session. The comments in the chat are uniformly positive. We hope that you'll join us for future sessions. You should feel free to send any comments and suggestions for future events to the Education Committee, and you can email clairemeehan@gmail.com. Somebody will put that in the chat. We also invite you to visit the SCAN website and consider joining us. SCAN is currently mobilizing for the election, September 24th, Day of Action, COP26, as David was saying. If you want to keep up to date, but you don't want to join at this time, you could also sign up for the monthly newsletter. And of course, please feel free to donate to SCAN if you like what we're doing. You can send an e-transfer to scandonation@rogers.com. We have work to do. Let's do it together.